Welcome back, trolls, to another episode of True Crime Trolls. Today, we're diving into a world that's often seen as peaceful and secluded, the Amish community. But even in the most tranquil settings, dark secrets can lurk beneath the surface. From shocking crimes to hidden scandals, we're uncovering the stories that you won't find in the headlines. If you're as fascinated by these untold tales as we are, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss any of the chilling content we have in store for you. Now, let's get into it. In the heart of Pennsylvania, where the rolling hills and dense woods seem to swallow the small, insular Amish communities, there existed a village known as Pine Hollow. The residents lived simple lives, untouched by modern technology, and adhered to their strict religious beliefs. They were a tight-knit group, bound by tradition, secrecy, and an unspoken fear of the outside world. But beneath the surface of Pine Hollow, darkness festered. One chilly autumn night, under a crescent moon that cast eerie shadows across the fields, a young woman named Sarah Yoder vanished without a trace. She was the daughter of one of the most respected families in the village, known for her kindness and piety. Her disappearance sent shockwaves through the community. The elders convened in secret, whispering among themselves about what should be done. The English, as they called the outsiders, were not to be involved. The sheriff would not be summoned. This was an Amish matter, and it would be handled as such. Weeks passed, and the village grew more tense with each day. The men searched the woods and fields, but Sarah was nowhere to be found. Her family prayed endlessly, their faith shaken to the core. But there was another, darker side to the story, one that no one dared to speak of openly. Isaac Zook, a reclusive man who lived on the edge of the village, was known for his strange behavior. He rarely attended church services, and when he did, his eyes were always downcast, his hands trembling. Rumors swirled about Isaac, that he was a man tormented by demons, that he spoke to spirits in the dead of night. But no one could ever confirm these whispers, and the elders chose to turn a blind eye, preferring to believe that Isaac was simply troubled rather than possessed. One night, months after Sarah's disappearance, a group of young men decided to take matters into their own hands. They were tired of the elders' inaction, tired of living in fear. They would confront Isaac and demand answers. Under the cover of darkness, they approached Isaac's small, dilapidated home. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of decay. The men hesitated, their courage wavering. But then they saw it, a faint light flickering through the window. It was late, and no one in Pine Hollow was awake at this hour, except Isaac. They crept closer, peering through the grimy glass. What they saw inside froze their blood. Isaac stood in the center of the room, surrounded by strange symbols etched into the wooden floor. Candles flickered around him, casting long, dancing shadows. In his hands, he held a bundle, a tattered quilt wrapped around something heavy. As the men watched, horrified, Isaac slowly unwrapped the bundle, revealing the decomposing body of Sarah Yoder. Her eyes were wide open, staring into the void, her mouth twisted in a silent scream. The men recoiled, choking back their terror, but they couldn't look away. Isaac began to speak, his voice low and guttural, as if something else were speaking through him. He chanted in a language none of the men could understand, his words growing more frantic With each passing second, the room seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the air thick with the scent of rot and decay. Suddenly, Isaac's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto the men at the window. They felt a cold, malevolent presence wash over them, paralyzing them with fear. Isaac's mouth curled into a twisted grin, and he spoke, this time in words they could understand. She called to them, he hissed. She wanted to leave, but they wouldn't let her. Now she is theirs. The men stumbled back, finally breaking free of their paralysis. They ran as fast as they could back to the village, their hearts pounding in their chests. When they reached the safety of the church, they told the elders what they had seen. The next morning, the entire village marched to Isaac's home. But when they arrived, the house was empty, the strange symbols scrubbed away, the candles extinguished. Isaac was gone, and with him, any trace of Sarah Yoder's body. The elders declared that Isaac had fled into the woods, but the truth was far more horrifying. The men who had seen Sarah's body were never the same. They spoke of nightmares, of hearing her voice in the wind, calling out for help. Some claimed they saw her figure, pale and ghostly, wandering the fields at night, her eyes hollow, her soul lost. Pine Hollow was never the same after that. The community kept to themselves, even more. The once welcoming village now shrouded in fear and suspicion. And though the elders insisted that Isaac was gone, that the evil had left with him, the villagers knew better. Late at night, when the wind howled through the trees and the moon hung low in the sky, they could still hear it, the faint, haunting sound of Sarah Yoder's voice, echoing through the darkness, a reminder that some secrets can never be buried. Edward Gingerich was born into the Old Order Amish, a group known for their simple living, plain dress, and reluctance to adopt many conveniences of modern technology. From an early age, Edward was different. He struggled with the strict rules and regulations of Amish life, often feeling confined and misunderstood. He was known to be a bit of a rebel, sometimes pushing back against the rigid structures of the Amish faith. In 1983, Edward married Katie Stoltzfus, a kind and devoted woman who embodied the values of their community. Together, they had 3 children and tried to live a life in line with their faith. However, Edward's growing dissatisfaction with Amish life, combined with his deteriorating mental health, began to drive a wedge between them. Edward was plagued by what many now believe was untreated schizophrenia. His mental state gradually worsened over the years. But within the Amish community, mental illness was often viewed through the lens of spiritual struggle rather than a medical condition. Instead of receiving proper psychiatric care, Edward was subjected to traditional treatments, such as herbal remedies and counsel from Amish elders. Unfortunately, these measures were ineffective, and Edward's condition continued to spiral out of control. As Edward's mental health deteriorated, he began to experience intense and frightening delusions. He became increasingly paranoid, believing that he was the target of dark forces beyond his control. Edward was convinced that demons were infiltrating his life, using those closest to him, especially his wife, Katie, as vessels to harm him. He started hearing voices that whispered terrifying thoughts into his mind, feeding his growing paranoia and fear. One of Edward's most persistent delusions was that Katie was possessed by an evil spirit sent to destroy him. He became obsessed with the idea that she was conspiring with these demonic entities to poison him and turn his children against him. In his twisted perception of reality, he saw Katie's loving and caring actions as sinister attempts to harm him. This belief grew stronger each day, consuming his thoughts and driving a wedge between him and the world around him. Edward also believed that his body was being transformed in unnatural ways, a delusion common among individuals suffering from severe schizophrenia. He thought his internal organs were rotting or being rearranged by these evil forces, which fueled his belief that he was cursed or being punished. These delusions became so intense that Edward often refused to eat, convinced that Katie was poisoning his food and that consuming it would only speed up his demise. As his delusions worsened, Edward began to isolate himself from the community, withdrawing into a dark and paranoid world of his own creation. He started to see signs of the supposed demonic presence everywhere, in the shadows of their farmhouse, in the flickering of a candle, and in the slightest movement of Katie's eyes. He became convinced that the only way to save himself and his children was to destroy the source of this evil, his wife. On that fateful Thursday, March 18th, 1993, the tension within the Gingerick household reached its breaking point. Edward had become increasingly paranoid and delusional, convinced that Katie and others in the community were conspiring against him. He believed that demons were controlling his wife, and that the only way to save himself and his children was to destroy the source of evil he saw in her. That morning, Edward's behavior was erratic, and Katie, sensing the danger, tried to go about her day while keeping an eye on her husband. She knew he was struggling, but she likely could not have imagined the violence that was about to erupt. As the day wore on, Edward's paranoia grew. In the small kitchen of their modest farmhouse, as their children played nearby, Edward suddenly snapped. In a frenzied and brutal attack, he struck Katie repeatedly with his fists, overpowering her as she tried to defend herself. But his rage was far from over. In a moment of sheer horror, Edward grabbed a nearby wood-burning stove lifter, a heavy iron tool used to adjust the stove, and began to savagely beat Katie with it. The children, terrified and confused, watched in helpless shock as their mother was brutally attacked. Edward, lost in his delusions, was beyond reason. After beating Katie, Edward took a large kitchen knife and began to stab her. The violence was so extreme that it shocked even the authorities, who later arrived at the scene. The once peaceful farmhouse was now a gruesome crime scene, with blood staining the floors and walls. Katie Gingerick was left unrecognizable, the victim of a rage that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. The Amish community, known for its forgiveness and close ties, was left reeling in the aftermath of the murder. Such an act of violence was unheard of in their world, where disputes were typically settled peacefully and crime was almost non-existent. Edward Gingerick did not flee the scene. Instead, in a state of shock and confusion, he wandered into the nearby fields and woods, where he was eventually found by members of the community. He was incoherent, his mind shattered by the horrific act he had just committed. When the authorities arrived, they were met with a scene of unimaginable horror. Edward was taken into custody without resistance. He seemed to have little understanding of what he had done, still trapped in the grip of his delusions. The trial that followed was a painful ordeal for the Amish community. Many of them had never even stepped foot in a courtroom before, let alone been involved in such a high-profile case. During the trial, Edward's defense team argued that he was legally insane at the time of the murder, suffering from untreated schizophrenia that had led to his delusional and violent behavior. The court was presented with evidence of Edward's deteriorating mental state, including testimonies from those who had witnessed his strange behavior in the months leading up to the murder. The jury ultimately found Edward guilty of third-degree murder, but mentally ill. He was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in a psychiatric prison where he would receive treatment for his mental illness. The murder of Katie Gingerich by her husband Edward remains one of the most shocking and tragic events in the history of the Amish community. It forced the community to confront the reality of mental illness and the limitations of their traditional methods of dealing with such issues. In the years that followed, Edward's case became a subject of discussion and study among mental health professionals, legal experts, and those interested in the intersection of faith, mental illness, and crime. The case highlighted the need for better understanding and treatment of mental health issues, especially in insular communities like the Amish, where outside intervention is often resisted. Edward Gingerich was eventually released from prison in 2008 after serving 15 years, but his release was met with mixed emotions. While the Amish are known for their capacity for forgiveness, the memories of that horrific day were still fresh in the minds of many. In January 2011, Edward was found dead in a barn, having taken his own life. His death marked the final chapter in a tragic life story that began with promise but ended in despair and violence. Eli Stutzman was raised in Apple Creek, Ohio, within a deeply religious Amish family. The Amish way of life, characterized by simplicity, hard work, and devotion to God, was all that Eli knew growing up. From an early age, Eli struggled with the constraints of his community's rigid expectations. He was known for being secretive, manipulative, and troubled by the strict rules of Amish life, setting him apart from others in his community. In 1974, at the age of 24, Eli married Ida Stutzman, a young Amish woman from a neighboring community. Their marriage was arranged, as is common in the Amish tradition, and it was expected to be a lifelong union. But from the beginning, their relationship was far from harmonious. Eli was a controlling and emotionally abusive husband. He dictated every aspect of Ida's life, from how she dressed to how she interacted with others. He often isolated her from her friends and family, cutting her off from the support system that could have helped her recognize the danger she was in. Ida, like many Amish women, was taught to submit to her husband and not question his authority, making her vulnerable to Eli's manipulation. Ida's life with Eli was marked by fear and anxiety. He was unpredictable, prone to sudden outbursts of anger that left her walking on eggshells. Despite the turmoil at home, Ida tried to be a dutiful wife and mother, raising their son Danny with love and care. However, the strain of living with Eli took a toll on her health and well-being. In 1977, just 3 years into their marriage, Ida died under mysterious circumstances. Eli claimed that she had collapsed suddenly from a ruptured cyst, although her death was officially ruled as a result of natural causes. Many in the community suspected that Eli had a hand in her demise. He had been the only one with her when she died, and his cold, detached behavior following her death only fueled the rumors. However, no evidence was found to support these suspicions, and the case was closed. After Ida's death, Eli wasted no time in leaving the Amish community. He took his young son Danny and moved far from his Amish roots, seeking a new life where he could escape the scrutiny of his past. Eli's relationship with his son Danny was complex and deeply troubled. After leaving the Amish community, Eli and Danny lived a transient life, moving frequently from place to place. Eli took on various odd jobs to support them, but he remained distant and emotionally unavailable to his son. Danny, a bright and innocent child, craved his father's love and attention, but Eli was incapable of providing the nurturing care that Danny needed. Instead, Eli saw Danny as a burden, a reminder of the responsibilities he had tried to escape when he left the Amish community. Eli was often harsh and critical, berating Danny for small mistakes and withholding affection. He rarely allowed Danny to socialize with other children, keeping him isolated and dependent on his father. As they moved from town to town, Eli's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would leave Danny alone for long periods, sometimes days at a time, while he pursued his own interests. When they did interact, Eli was controlling and manipulative, often using fear to keep Danny in line. Danny's life was one of uncertainty and instability, with no one to turn to for help. In December 1985, Eli made a chilling decision that would end in tragedy. He took Danny to a remote area near Chester, Nebraska, under the pretense of going on a trip. In reality, Eli had no intention of returning with his son. On December 15th, Danny's body was discovered in a snow-covered ditch along a rural road. He was dressed in warm clothes, but was found with no shoes, despite the freezing conditions. The child had been dead for several days, and his death was initially a mystery. Eli claimed that Danny had been sick and died suddenly. However, investigators quickly became suspicious of Eli's story. The autopsy revealed that Danny had died of exposure, but it was clear that he had been placed in the ditch after he had already died, likely by his father. Eli's lack of emotion and inconsistent statements only deepened the investigators' suspicions. Despite the growing evidence against him, Eli was not immediately charged with Danny's death. Instead, he continued his nomadic lifestyle, evading authorities and maintaining his facade of innocence. In early 1985, several months before Danny's death, Eli had been living in Austin, Texas. It was here that he befriended David Tyler, Ty Coleman, a young, outgoing man who worked as a hairdresser. Ty was known for his trusting nature and friendly disposition, which made him an easy target for someone as manipulative as Eli. Eli and Ty struck up a friendship, with Ty unaware of the dark secrets his new friend was hiding. Eli was charming and charismatic, traits that he used to gain Ty's trust. As their friendship grew, Ty began to confide in Eli, sharing details of his life and personal struggles. Eli, in turn, presented himself as a loyal and supportive friend, all the while plotting how to use Ty for his own gain. In early April 1985, Ty's body was found in a burned-out barn in Colorado. He had been shot in the head execution style, and the barn was set on fire in an attempt to destroy evidence. The location of the barn was near an area where Eli had been staying, and investigators quickly connected him to the crime. It was later discovered that Ty had planned to move in with Eli, having been promised a fresh start in a new place. However, Eli had no intention of keeping his promises. He saw Ty as another liability, someone who knew too much about his past and could potentially expose him. In a cold, and calculated move, Eli lured Ty to the barn under the pretense of helping him move, only to execute him and set the barn on fire. Eli's plan was to cover his tracks and continue his life on the run, but the authorities were closing in. Ty's death was just one of several suspicious deaths that would eventually be connected to Eli Stutzman, painting a grim picture of a man who seemed to leave tragedy in his wake wherever he went. Eli Stutzman's run from the law came to an end in 1986 after a series of events that finally exposed his crimes. Investigators, now fully aware of the pattern of suspicious deaths connected to Eli, began to piece together the evidence. The deaths of his wife Ida, his son Danny, and his friend Ty Coleman were all linked by the presence of Eli Stutzman. In November 1986, Eli was arrested in Austin, Texas, on charges related to the deaths of Danny Stutzman and Ty Coleman. The investigation revealed that Eli had likely murdered Danny to rid himself of the burden of a child, and Ty because he knew too much about Eli's criminal activities. At his trial, Eli was portrayed as a manipulative and cold-hearted killer who had no regard for human life. The prosecution argued that Eli had planned and executed these murders to free himself from the responsibilities and complications of his relationships. The jury was convinced, and Eli Stutzman was convicted of murder.